fellow webmasters, this is yet another lesson, and in this lesson you are going to learn how to effectively arrange elements or the contents of a website. When we talk about elements or the contents, apparently we are referring to anything that appears on a web page. A typical web page has images, it has text, icons, links, and things like that. And as a professional website developer or designer, you should know how to effectively arrange these in a very beautiful way so that they can have an appealing visual effect to whoever takes a look at them. If you take a look at how elements appear on websites, this is a typical example. This is what we call the CSS box model. CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets, and it is a language that is used to style websites and to create layout for it. Taking a look at this CSS module, this is exactly how every element appears on a website. To take this one, for instance, we have this text element, and this text element is within a container. Now outside of the container is a margin that separates that container from other ones. Just at the edges of the container is a border, and within the container is where we have our text element. Just around the text elements are spaces that we call padding. So let's take a close look at this and how exactly this affects any website. We will do that by taking a look at these elements here as a real-world example. Now, we mentioned that within a container are elements, and there is padding, there is border, and there is a margin beyond the borders. Paddings and margins are two important elements in web design. They essentially do the same thing. They create extra space. But as to whether to use margin or padding will depend on where it is that you are modifying. Let's take a close look at these three elements here. These are three rectangles, and within each of these are some other elements. Clearly, the outside of each of these is a margin. So there is a margin between this first one and this second one, and also between this second one and the third one. And even from this, you can say that the margin is what has shown here in green. That said, when do we use margins and when do we use paddings? Let's start with margins. One thing is clear here, that margins are applied at the outside of your element. So if you take this whole thing, the text and the icons here as our element, and this being the border, then the white spaces around this rectangle is the margin. So from here we can say that margins are applied to the outside of elements, and they affect how far your element is from other elements. As you can see here, there is some small space between this and that, and we can either reduce this or increase it. Now with padding, we are talking about the inner of this container, starting from where this icon is to the last letter here. Every space around this is known as padding. So padding is applied inside of your element, and they affect how far your element is from the border here. So we are going to use these principles in our website design project. Let's start by editing the page with Elementor. So edit with Elementor. So here I'm going to demonstrate how these two principles, padding and margins, how they really work, and why you would need to apply these throughout your project. these are various components. If you want to modify the contents of each of these components, then as usual, you use this pencil tool here. And if you place the cursor on it, you see edit fancy box. So clearly, the name of this element as done by the theme author is fancy box. So once you click on that pencil tool, you'll be able to modify the contents here. Now, more than that, we have the margins here and the paddings as well. Talking about the padding, it is apparently the space between this whole thing and the next border. The next border is this. So this white space will be the padding. So for instance, let's say that the top here, which we refer to as padding top, let's say we increase this number to something, let's say 50. Now, having done this, we can now see the space between this and the border. But there is something to here we have to take note of, which is the values are linked together by default. So once we do for padding top, it will be applied for padding bottom, padding left, and padding right. So we can unlink the values so that we'll be able to work on the individual paddings when we deem fit. So let's say we go back to 0, and then here we are unlinking the values. So whatever we do at each of these padding sections will not affect the other side. So let's say once again that padding top is 30. A padding of 30 pixels between this element and the space at the top, but within the same container. And let's say we want to do the same for the right hand side and give a value. We can enter the value directly, or we can use the arrow here to increase it. And as you are increasing, if you check the right hand side, which is of course right padding, you see the changes being effected. You see that there is a space being created between this whole element and then the border. As you can see, the element moving, the space being created. That is how padding works. So let's say we want to restore the values to default, 0 and 0. So clearly, the padding will create a space within this element or container, while the margin will create an extra space at the outside of the container. Let's use these ones too as another example. These are two different elements. This is a text element and that is also a text element. So if you want to modify this and create a space around this text alone, then clearly we are going to use padding. But if you want to distance this from that, then we will use margin. So you click on this pencil tool, then you go to advanced, and here we want to unlink the values. In actual sense, there is a space around this text, both left and right, which means that there is already an existing value for this, but it might not show here. But we can still modify this. So in this case, let's say we want to either reduce or increase the spaces around this text, which is padding. So let's talk about padding right, which is this area. So if you increase it, so let's work on the padding left, which is the space from the border to the element itself. So with padding left, let's increase this by using the arrow up here and see the result. So as you increase it, you see that more and more white space is created between the border and the text. You can go back to 0. For padding top, this is what will happen. A lot of space will be produced up there. as well as the other areas. The same will be true of those areas too. So having understood this clearly, we are going to use padding in most of the cases, and when the need arises to use margins, we will equally do so. Let's start from this section. When we hover over this, you see that the margin for this whole area is around this place, and each of these elements also have their individual margins. So let's place the cursor in the middle here. Now clicking on the middle of the section means we are selecting the whole section. So clicking on that section, we will now work on the layout, the style, and then the advanced settings. So advanced. And clearly here we can see that the bottom has 26 pixels margin. The top here has 90 pixels padding. Now you may have a different value because I must have changed some of the values. But no matter whatever values you have for padding and margins, you can still modify it accordingly to create a very beautiful visual effect. So let's start. What is the motif in the first place? The motif is to reduce the space between this and that. So clearly we want to reduce this white space here. So let's tackle the padding top. So the padding top apparently here is the distance between this whole margin and this area. As we've said earlier, that is the space between the element and the border. So here it is 90 pixels. So let's say we want to reduce this to a minimum value. The number is here. We can directly type the number, a reduced number here, or we can use the arrow down to decrease it and see the effect as we do so. So clicking on the down arrow here, you see that the gap between the elements and the border is reducing. So if you reduce it to the point where you can say you've attained the desired result, you would leave it at that point and then update the changes. Let's work on this section too. So by clicking on the middle here, we can work around the space, that is the padding and the margin of this whole element as well. Go to advanced, unlink the values so that we would know what to add or what to subtract. So let's unlink them first. The space between that and the next element here, all of them are 0, 0. And you should understand that this point, clicking on the middle here, is going to modify the whole rectangle. So here too, it is clear that this white space is the space that was produced from the image. So this whole thing is an image. If it is an image and not necessarily a white space by the editor here, then what we have to do is to go back to the image that we inserted and to crop this part away. And now this is what we have. There is no undue space between the first element here and the second one here. And in this case, if you want to comfortably increase the space by introducing more white space between this slider and the next element here, then you can do that by clicking on any of them and then inserting the white space accordingly. Advanced, padding top, then we can increase it. So this is solely your discretion. As you increase the value and you get to where you think the space is appropriate, then you can stop it and update it. Having done this, let's now insert some content as part of our website design project. Something like our services. Then this as well, some content. So this is where you might apply some of the techniques we have learned. This whole layout has been set to 50% of this and 50% of that. As you increase it, you are rather creating more space and pushing this content away from that. So to bring this here, there are two options. Either to decrease the layout so that it becomes something like 70 for this place and 30 for this place, Or better still, because each of them has 50-50, to bring this content here, you have to use negative margin. Why do we use negative margin? Let's reduce this value to 0 and see what happens. So you can see that as you move down, the content shifts to the left. So even when you get to 0, the content remains at where it is supposed to be. And to go beyond that point, you can further reduce, then you enter into negative. And as you reduce it, you can see the content moving to the left, so that it goes beyond its demarcated margins. So you can use the same principle in this regard. But in this scenario, the better thing to do is to reduce the percentage allocated to this column. So if you hover over the section, you see there is a layout icon here. This arrow is preventing this from appearing. So let me bring this downward somewhere. So hovering over this, you see there's a layout icon here. This is layout. And the inscription is edit column. If you click on that, you see that the column width has been set to 55.2%. So if we reduce this, then this one will increase because the two will sum up to 100. So let's change this to something like 35, meaning that the rest will be 65 for this place. And go back to set this one to the default margin 0. So click on this section, which is the right column, and we made the left margin minus 80 pixels. So let's now change that back to 0. So obviously you may find yourself doing a lot of trials and errors so as to get the perfect match. Let's get to the next section. So you can find content for all these sections. And let's focus on the layout and the appearance, including colors and those related. So to start with, I'll use another section. Let's say this section. There are basically 3 aspects that you can handle here. The layout, which has these, as to whether the content, the width should be boxed as we see here, or we want it to be full section, full width, so that there will not be any gaps at the left or at the right. We can determine that here. You can increase the width also here, or reduce it from here. Then the gap between the columns. So you can go through one after another and see exactly how this works. The height, we can set a minimum height, or to make it fit to the screen as per the aspect ratio. Then the vertical alignment too, we can do something about that, as well as all these sections. Whether we want to stretch the section or we don't want to stretch it so that we decrease the whole width, we can determine that here as well.